Most probiotics on the market don't actually do anything.
True.
Spicy. I should take probiotics after taking antibiotics.
False. It's during to protect your gut.
Okay, I'm going to get into that. If I eat fermented foods like kimchi, sauerkraut, I don't need to take probiotic supplements.
Conditions apply. They're different things.
Okay, are fermented foods better than probiotic supplements?
Again, different things, different indications.
Does freezing or cooking probiotic foods destroy some of those benefits?
Freezing, generally not. Cooking, generally yes.
Okay. And should we be avoiding additives and emulsifiers in our food as much as possible?
We should become, I think, emulsifier aware. We don't need to go crazy on it.
I love that. Emulsifier aware. That could be on a t-shirt. Megan, we're going to get into probiotics in a big way today. Let's start off by defining exactly what we mean by probiotics, because you've alluded to the differences between different products, and I don't think people understand the nuance of those distinctions.
Yeah, no, it's such an important one, right? Because everyone's always like, oh, just have fermented foods, or I'll just have a probiotic supplement. And like, they are very different things. So in terms of the definition of a probiotic, right? So it's these live microbes, which when given in adequate amounts, confer a health benefit. That's kind of the scientific definition. Now, the thing about fermented foods is if I was to make kefir at my house, you were to make it at your house, they would contain different strains of bacteria, so different types of bacteria, and therefore it can't, or it doesn't fit the definition of a probiotic, because you need to know the exact strain. And I say strain, it's just like the type of bacteria. It's a scientific name for an individual type of bacteria. And so it would contain different ones, and therefore we wouldn't know whether your strains had the benefit because we didn't know which ones are in it, right? So that's why I kind of make that really different, that distinguish between the two, because they are different. There's different evidence in different areas.
Okay. So when people are buying a probiotic, that's assuming it's a good quality one, not like the majority of them on the market, but when they're buying one, they are getting a guaranteed strain of a microbe. Whereas if you're growing it, in a kefir or a kimchi that you've made at home, you just don't know what you're getting. Hence, it's not considered to be a probiotic.
Absolutely. 100% spot on. Yeah.
Okay, great. So when we talk about probiotics specifically, if I'm in the health food store and I'm looking through this like vast library of probiotics, what are the things that I'm looking for on the back of a packet in terms of the names, that you've alluded to strains, but some of the things higher up the order?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really important point that people need to start thinking about, well, why do you want to take a probiotic, right? I think before they go to the health food store and go to this section, because it can be so overwhelming, but there is no clinical evidence. There's never been a clinical trial that's shown that taking any type of probiotic, any type of strain is going to improve your general gut health, like your microbial diversity.
Okay.
Right?
All right.
So if you want general gut health improvements, that's where fermented foods comes in.
Okay.
Right? There's this great study from Stanford University. They showed having a high fermented food diet actually increased the different types of microbes you've got in your gut. And actually also there was some reduction in markers of inflammation.
Okay.
So I think that is one of the biggest myths that we should be busting, right? For general gut health, don't go down probiotic supplement path, right?
Okay.
Have the fermented foods and all the plant diversity and those sorts of things.
So you've answered one of my big questions there already. So whether a daily probiotic supplement is actually something that could potentially have benefits for people that don't have a specific condition or a symptom or anything like that, it's not going to confer any benefits, or at least there's no evidence currently to suggest that there is any benefit.
Exactly. So there's currently no evidence. And what I would say is, there's a little bit of evidence. It was a small clinical trial, but it showed that if you just went and took a random probiotic off the shelf, right, after a course of antibiotics, your microbiome actually seemed to take longer to reestablish to your baseline compared to those who didn't take one.
Okay.
So actually, that's kind of, again, a small study, but for me, highlighting that, these are live microorganisms. We shouldn't just be taking them as an insurance policy the way they're being sold to us, right? And I did my PhD in probiotics, and, I've seen how powerful they can be in the clinical setting. And I'm sure we'll go into some of the clinical data where in certain indications, they can be really beneficial and powerful. But it's just this whole way that society has approached them. And it's not individuals' fault. I think it's the way the marketing, claims have kind of led us to believe that if we want good gut health, we should take a probiotic. But it's just not scientific at all.
Yeah, and I remember having those conversations with families and patients when I was working in the NHS, that taking a probiotic after you had your antibiotic course seems like a sensible thing to do. I mean, what's the harm in taking a probiotic? But to your point, when that study came out, I remember thinking, oh, God, I'm going to change my approach on this, because we are dealing with, it's a supplement, but it's essentially having pharmaceutical-like effects, it's having medicinal effects. So we have to be careful about who's taking them, after which antibiotic, at what point during or after antibiotics. And you alluded to maybe during the antibiotic course might be the best course of action. But we have to be sensible about these and evidence-based.
100%. I think the other thing to think about is we should probably move away from this concept of take a probiotic or not take a probiotic, right? Okay. Because there's, thousands of different strains. So like you were kind of alluding to before in terms of, there's all the different types. People have heard of the Bifidobacterium genus. Yeah. So that's just a family, right? But there's several hundreds of them. Go to the underneath layer, then you've got the species. And that an example of that is lactis, right? So Bifidobacteria lactis. But again, there's many different types. So you need to go underneath of that, and that's where you get the strain, like BB12, right? Okay. So you need to really get to that strain level. And the way I describe it in clinic to people is, if you have iron deficiency, I'm not going to go and give you a vitamin D supplement. I would give you the iron supplement, right? That's the exact same way we need to think about probiotics. So
that's a really good way of thinking about it. Like, I've got a deficiency in a mineral. Ergo, I'm going to take a micronutrient supplement. Whereas, what you're saying is, no, you need to take the specific micronutrient supplement, not just a micronutrient supplement.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. Or even if you go to the medication level, right?
Yeah.
You're not going to take blood pressure medication for your type 2 diabetes. Yeah. Like, you need to get specific if you want the therapeutic benefit that we have these randomized control trials showing. And with that, obviously, comes a whole lot of complexity, right? Like, I appreciate not everyone's done a PhD in probiotics or, has studied this space. And therefore, it can be super confusing to be like, okay, which strain do I take? Yeah. When do I take it? Why? What dose? What format? Because I think that's another thing that I see often is where this like one format, i.e., liquid, is way better than capsule or way better than powder has been pushed, right? Yeah. But actually that, again, is not science backed, where it depends on what you're trying to manage and what the clinical trials have used. So there's kind of these gut models that a lot of the marketing teams have really pushed and be like, oh, look, it looks like this liquid has survived more than a capsule or a powder. And you're like, but I love gut models for hypothesis generating, right? Great. But we've got the human clinical trials where we see what happens in an actual human. Why don't we use that? Yeah. So it's kind of a case, I think, of a lot of smoky mirrors around different things. And what I always say is come back to, has there been a randomized control trial? What format did they use? And for things like upper respiratory tract infections like cold and flu, actually, they've shown that in powder format, because you want it to activate in that upper respiratory region, right? And if you're giving it as a capsule, then perhaps it's not going to be as effective. And one of the studies gave the exact same strain. It was preventing pneumonia. And those given it as a, in the powder format. Another one had it as a nasogastric tube because these people were in hospital. So it bypassed the kind of upper respiratory region. And only that given as a powder format had a clinical result, a positive outcome in that study.
Gotcha.
So again, it's kind of this proof of mechanism. So it always, for me, comes down to we need to get specific. And I know it's so hard for people who aren't in this space to get there. But we've had to do it with, micronutrients, we've had to do it with medication. So it's just going to be this next generation of where we move to with probiotics.
Totally. So if we just circle back to what we're looking for on a probiotic packet, right? So we're looking for the genus, the species, and the strain. if I'm looking at a probiotic and I can only sort of see the genus, it's got Lactobacilli in, or maybe it says Rhamnosus as the species. Is that like a bit of a red flag that it's just not good enough and they're not actually using the specific strain?
Yeah, so it's a red flag that they haven't identified the strain. So I would never be taking something at a species level.
Okay.
And again, just to really hit home that point, it's an exaggerated one, but E. coli species, right? So a lot of people are like, oh, that's terrible.
Yeah.
But actually at the strain level, you can have a lot of differences. So E. coli Nissel, I think it's like 1917 is the strain name.
Okay.
Like they're always really weird on strains.
Yeah.
So that one actually is one of the oldest probiotics on the market. It's got efficacy in ulcerative colitis.
Okay.
Whereas most of the other E. coli strains, some of them can actually be deadly, right? And that's at the strain level. So if you're just focusing on the species level, they can have completely different effects.
Totally.
So I think it just feeds in, to this whole understanding of the gut microbiome, those trillions of microbes in our gut. Each different one has a different skill set, does different things. And that's why people with more different types of microbes in them, are healthier because they've got more skills and all of those sorts of assets.
Yeah.
So we just need to think of that and then think, okay, same goes with probiotics. Each individual strain will have a different functionality, different mechanism, will have a different role.
Gotcha. I promise we're going to get to the specific use cases of when to use specific probiotics, but I want to get through the, definitions of probiotics and exactly what we're talking about. Let's talk a bit about form factor. So you've alluded to the fact that powdered is, depending on the context, sometimes better than liquid or capsule. Is the only way to approach form factor really thinking about, okay, what you're using it for? So there's no such thing as a hierarchy of liquid is better than powdered, which is better than supplement or tablet form. Is that the right way of thinking?
Yeah, so it's always, because remember, each strain will have different functionalities. Okay. So a lot of the strains like Lactobacillus rhamnosus GG, so LGG, that's actually got the most scientific published papers on that strain in the entire world, right? Okay. So that's the most well-known, well-characterized one. That one actually is very much acid and bile acid resistant, right? So actually that's quite good at being in a powder format. Gotcha. Whereas other ones, actually, maybe it does need to be protected from more of that acid. Or needs to be given at a higher dose. So there's so much kind of complexity around that. So the way that I would always say to someone is just use the format that was used in the clinical trial showing the benefit that you're after. Because that's the best way to know, how it's going to work.
So for someone who's using it perhaps for IBS or IBD, you want something that's going to survive that acid bath when you go past the stomach, and then the bile that you're going to find in the small intestine, and then making its way all the way to the large intestine, rather than something that you want to be working on a bit more locally or higher up the digestive tract.
Exactly. Okay. But again, the only way you'll know that is just using the clinical data, because again, a lot of the strains coming through, the probiotic strains, actually are resistant. So you don't need to worry like, oh my gosh, it's in the powder, it's all in the liquid, it's not enterically coated capsule. Yeah. Right. So it's always coming back down to the human clinical trials. Yeah. And because we've got them, let's use them. Right. Yeah. So I think, a lot of research areas where it's so new, where we've only got animal studies or, gut models, and that, sometimes you have to go off mechanisms and then rely on that. But we don't. So I'm like, why go a step backwards, right? Let's just use the best result, the gold standard that we've got.
Totally. You mentioned a complicated word there, enteric coated.
Yeah,
what does that
right.
mean for
so
folks?
Essentially that is just when it's kind of acid resistant type of capsule. And yeah, it's kind of, I think most of the strains to date with good evidence don't require that. But some of the really sensitive ones,
interesting.
Perhaps,
okay. Okay, great. All right, so we've talked about form factor. We've talked about the making sure you're getting the right strain, because it's the equivalent of taking a vitamin D tablet when you actually need a 9 tablet. What about dose? So it seems in the world of probiotics, more is better, or at least that's the way things are marketed. Is that strictly true?
Not strictly true. I mean, there was one IBS study which a lot of people reference where the slightly lower dose had greater efficacy than a higher dose. Okay. But that was kind of one of the only studies that's shown that. So I think it's true to say that you need a certain dose to ensure it's in adequate amounts, right?
Okay.
If it's a little bit higher, I wouldn't freak out, but ideally you're trying to match it to the dose. I wouldn't go under the dose shown in a clinical trial to have a benefit. And then on the point about the strains, which we didn't necessarily cover, but I think is an important one because I'm starting to see a lot with companies where, frustratingly, they just pull individual strains that on their own the strain may have shown a benefit, but they just add it with other strains, and then like, oh my god, we've got an amazing one with like 14 clinically backed strains, and they've never tested it together.
Right.
And what we know about bacteria is they can compete, right?
Yeah.
So again, it comes down to this, like, you need to have proven that formulation is going to lead to the benefits that you want. You can't just think they're all going to be additive.
Yeah.
Because they are very competitive animals.
Well, using your analogy about pharmaceuticals, it's like me pairing an antihypertensive drug with a painkiller, with a cholesterol-lowering drug, with an antibiotic, and saying, well, all of these individual drugs have done great stuff in their individual trials, so we're going to lump them all together and just give them to you in one handy pill.
I love that analogy. It's exactly what's going on. And everyone's like, yeah, the more the better.
The more the better,
and all
exactly,
in that scenario, you're just like, that is wild. That's a concoction that will kill someone, right?
Yeah, totally. Okay, great. So that's a really good point. So like looking at multiple strains as a combo is not necessarily better, in the same way a higher dose is not necessarily better as well. Okay, great. In terms of form factor, dose, survivability, all that kind of stuff, are there any other things that people need to know about? Like, is freeze drying better, or is there certain preparation methods? Are those better in terms of?
No, again, it comes down to the individual strain will react in a different way. So it's, I think we've touched on the main ones in terms of getting that right strain, getting that right formulation, getting the right dose and the right format.
Okay. Yeah. Let's talk about use cases. So where do we have actual evidence that it could be beneficial and a useful adjunct to other therapies that somebody might be having?
Yeah. So when I've kind of done a deep dive in this space, I believe there are 4 areas where I hand on heart say, I would recommend this to everyone. And actually, a lot of people don't realize that the World Gastro Organization have guidelines on probiotics, which is very helpful, right? But again, clinicians that aren't specializing in this space just aren't aware of them.
Yeah.
So one of the areas where the World Gastro Organization has given level 1 evidence, so top level evidence, is for taking a specific strain of bacteria during antibiotics.
Okay.
So that is the LGG strain of bacteria. During antibiotics at a dose of 10 billion CFUs, colony-forming units, how we measure them. Just think 10 billion bacteria twice a day.
Okay. And that's Lactobacillus rhamnosus, sorry? Or
GG,
yeah.
Okay. LGG, yep. Now, there has been like this nomenclature update of lactobacillus. They've kind of split them to different names, but I think let's not go there. I know, I'm like, as if it's not more complicated. So the current consensus is let's just keep it with lactobacillus for the public thing. But just if any scientists are watching, they'll be aware of that.
Yeah.
So yes. And then in terms of, I guess, the clinical trials, so the randomized control trials, and placebo control, which I think if we've got the data again, it's like music to my ears, because we know placebo affects around 30% of people, right? And it's just, if you believe you're doing something good, you start to slightly change how you're eating and all these other things, which then overall has a different impact. So randomized, again, there's for the LGG that in antibiotics has been shown in adults and in children. So in children, all kids were on antibiotics. Half of them got the LGG strain, other half got placebo, obviously blinded. And those who had the LGG strain had it was about a 70% reduction in incidence of diarrhea during the antibiotics compared to the placebo group. Okay. And then in adults, again, that same strain LGG reduced their antibiotic-associated diarrhea, again, by around 70, maybe it's like 72% compared to placebo. Also reduced bloating and taste disturbances by, I think it's like between 50 and 60% as well compared to placebo.
Amazing.
So it's got, strong evidence. Placebo-controlled trials, which is why obviously the World Gastro Organization gave it level 1 evidence.
That's great. So level 1 evidence, if anyone's looking this up on the websites, that's the highest level of evidence that we should be looking out for.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, we'll link to these World Gastro Guidelines because I think it's quite important that they're disseminated and people are aware of them because they do a good job, obviously, in terms of looking at like the systematic reviews and the whole kind of body of evidence. Another one that both the World Gastro and the leading pediatric guidelines, so ESPGHAN, recommend is for colicky babies.
Okay.
So one of the strains is BB12, given at 1 billion CFU. And again, I think one of the clinical trials, there's 2 of them using that formulation. I think it was in close to 200 babies. It was the largest colicky probiotic study. And it significantly reduced fussing and crying in those who had the probiotic. It was like 150% times compared to placebo.
Wow.
Increased sleeping duration by an extra 60 minutes per day compared to baseline. And then parents' quality of life also skyrocketed. Again, they were blinded though.
Yeah.
So like there is really convincing.
Yeah.
And you know what? I mean, I don't know. Did Raphael have colic?
I mean, he didn't have colic, but
But a definition,
Yeah. I mean, like he was definitely, obviously, he aggressive sleeping and all the rest of it. But we were like, touch wood, quite lucky with Raphael only sleeping. But I've heard horror stories, obviously, being a clinician for many years and also like my colleagues and everything. So anything that could have that drastic an improvement would be welcome. And I'm guessing that the side effect profile of probiotics is pretty low, if not non-existent.
Again, if it's the right strain,
sure.
Right? So I would be very cautious of the strain. So for example, the LGG strain actually has got really good efficacy. I think there's meta-analysis in it's like 10,000 babies for preventing necrotizing enterocolitis in preterm infants. So it's like one of the safest.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't want to go and give a preterm infant BB12 unless there was, convincing evidence of safety profile.
Yeah. And just for the listener, that's a very severe inflammatory condition of the bowel that is seen in preterm
infants.
Infants,
Still developing. Yeah. So, and then BB12 is the most published probiotic bifidobacterium strain.
Okay.
So again, really good safety data in kids. So from birth, it's got that safety data.
Just circling back to the antibiotics. So I know we're jumping around a little bit here, but for the antibiotics, the reduction in diarrhea symptoms, was it when folks were on a specific type of antibiotic, or is it just different antibiotic courses for different reasons?
Yeah. So the adult one, so in terms of the World Gastro Organization, their guidelines is just all antibiotics. They don't kind of specify according to the type of antibiotic. I'm not aware of any specific studies that have gone into, is it more efficacious if you have this type of antibiotic versus this type of antibiotic?
Whether someone's got a UTI or upper respiratory tract infection.
Which one? And with one of the papers I quoted in terms of the adults, who are all on antibiotics, that was for H. pylori eradication, so it's triple therapy with proton pump inhibitor. Whereas I think the children's study was in children with all different types of antibiotics. I think they were all given, whatever was called for.
Yeah. And just for the listeners, so H. pylori is something that we want to try and eradicate in people with gastritis that is thought to be due to Helicobacter pylori, which is something that we can treat with triple therapy, which is a PPI, antibiotics, and omeprazole. Yeah. Is that it?
I think it's 2 types of antibiotics.
Two types of antibiotics and
PPI. And PPI,
Yeah, cool. Okay, great. So those are 2 big areas with lots of evidence. There were 2 others?
Yeah. So another one is is based on a Cochrane review. So the thing about the World Gastro Organization guidelines, love them, but very focused on gut-related things, right? So this is why it is such a confusing space. There's not like one place to go for all of the evidence because it's all different guidelines. Anyway, so for Cochrane review, for those who don't know, it's like an independent body where they pull together all the individual studies and assess it. And they've said that, yes, specific strains of bacteria can help prevent and delay or reduce the duration of cold and flu. So in 2 of the clinical trials, placebo control, 1 in kids, 1 in adults, they used the strains LGG and BB12 together. And in the kids, it was in infants, which is why both of my kids are on it for nursery park. So it was in the first year of life, they reduced the recurrence of upper respiratory tract infections by 50% compared to placebo.
Interesting.
And in adults, it was a reduction in the duration of the cold and flu by 2 days compared to placebo.
So this is when you're taking a so I've just started a cold, let's say, and I'm like, doing my broth and I'm doing all that kind of stuff. This is when that starts, and I start taking the probiotics.
So the studies were prophylactic. So actually, no, before as a
gotcha.
preventative.
Okay.
So they didn't have anything.
Okay.
Then they took it. They were given it, that or the placebo, and looked over time the incidence of upper respiratory tract infections.
How long do they follow them up for?
So
roughly?
one of the clinical trials in adults, I think it was 3 months.
Okay.
The other one, I like to say 6 months in children.
Mm-hmm.
Don't quote me on those exact. We'll get links to the
we'll link to those papers,
to the
sure.
papers.
Yeah.
And then in terms of, I think the severity of symptoms in the adult one was like reduced by over 30%.
Gotcha.
So that indication, and then the last one is bacterial vaginosis and thrush.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, as a medic, you know how effective antifungals and antibiotics are for those two, right? But the issue is relapse rate is huge. And I wasn't aware that 75% of women will experience at least one episode of thrush in their lifetime. Like, it's huge.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of makes sense
Does
now.
it?
Just
Yeah.
thinking like
How many
thinking
people
about,
you
like,
saw.
how many people we see with thrush.
Yeah.
And a lot of it, comes down to previous antibiotic use, and so I could probably, but it's still very high. It's still very high. Yeah.
And then the relapse, between 40 to 60%, right?
Yeah.
So yes, the medications are effective. And then so when people come and see me in clinic, they'd be like, what can I do about this? I'm like, sorry, it's like just the medical stuff. Like, yes, obviously unperfumed soap and non-synthetic knickers and stuff like that. But like, there is no evidence for the anti-candida diet, right? They'll come to me like, oh, I want this diet. And I'm like, cutting out fruit, like,
What
just
is the
doesn't seem
anti-candida
right.
diet?
So it's essentially, a diet that's not backed by any science, but essentially like reducing down things like fruit, high fruit, also some cheeses and some grains and stuff, with the concept that these are feeding the yeast.
Oh, okay.
And therefore making you more susceptible to vaginal infections. And they've done some studies, small studies, very historic, but they've given people like high doses of like actual sugar, and shown that actually it doesn't link to an increase unless you've got diabetes, which obviously then your blood sugars are unregulated, all that sort of stuff. So the whole concept of the diet is just doesn't make sense. And there is a little bit of data suggesting that like for bacterial vaginosis type of vaginal infection, having a high polyphenol, high plant diet can reduce your risk.
Oh, interesting.
It was an observational study, but still the concept is, well, then this anti-candida diet is cutting out some of these beneficial foods. Anyway, so moral of the story. So I was like, sorry, I would not recommend this. Anyway, so when I saw some of the clinical data, again, there's a Cochrane review. I think it's with thrush. So they used the specific combination of strains called, this is going to test my brain, LA14 and LHNO01 with some lactoferrin, which is
I'd just say you've got 2 kids, one is 4, one is 2, and the fact that you're just like with no notes in front of you, you're just reeling out these strain levels is pretty amazing for me.
And then remember, this is my job. I work at King's, it's my research role. But but that's what I mean. Like, how are we meant to, the average person, meant to be able, anyway,
totally.
Hopefully we'll get there. So that's the kind of the formulation. So it was given to women who had bacterial vaginosis diagnosed. So short-term antibiotics was given, and then as an adjunct, additional therapy, either a placebo or that formulation. And by 6 months, those in the active probiotic group had about, I think it was like a 50% reduction in risk of relapse compared to the placebo group.
Okay.
And that same formulations be given in those with vaginal thrush. Again, short-term course of antifungals, but as an adjunct therapy, additional therapy, either the placebo or that formulation. I think those who had that formulation had about a 3-fold reduced risk of relapse of vaginal thrush.
Wow.
So again, it's like,
I mean, it's in the context of there's nothing else that we can actually offer.
Yeah.
That's actually super impressive.
Yeah. And that's why I think, where I really like when I've looked at all the literature, kind of in my brain, the kind of criteria is, has there been, is there a clinical guideline or has there been a systematic review showing that a probiotic can help in that area? If there has been, I went on to the next kind of criteria of like, well, is there a better therapy on the market? Because what's the point of having a probiotic that's going to improve something by 5% when actually this other therapy, diet, is hugely effective? And we see that with weight loss. And then the next level is, okay, well, if there has been, there is this need there, has there been 2 randomized controlled trials using the same formulation, showing the same kind of benefit? So in my head, that's kind of the criteria I use to determine, is there good evidence to recommend one?
And that last one, you're looking for replicability. So, that gives it a little bit more confidence that, it's actually doing it.
Exactly. And you're choosing the right strains.
Exactly.
Yeah. Because I feel like, if there's 20 studies, we know that's why the whole p-value, when we talk about statistic analysis, right, you need to make sure the p-value is adequate, is there's always going to be at least one where it's going to show the opposite effect just by chance. Yeah. So, that's kind of the criteria in my head. But then obviously it is a really exciting space where there's always new studies coming out. But I'm kind of, unless I'm seeing someone one-on-one in clinic where they really want to try a probiotic, then that's my criteria. If they really want to try one and there has been a single randomized control trial, maybe no meta-analysis, then I might be like, okay, let's try replicate that if you want to on a one-to-one basis. But the chances of it actually working is, I'm not overly convinced by, but if, you're aware of that, let's go down that track.
Gotcha. And so outside of those 4 indications, right, that you've looked at in the World Gastro Society, the organization, have determined that there is evidence. Are you hopeful that there are other areas, but we just don't have the right studies or the right level of evidence for? Yeah,
absolutely. So again, I'll link it. I've done quite a few healthcare professional webinars, but it's not overly high level. So if, consumers want to watch it, where I've broken down like tons of different indications where I think, so I've got like good quality, so those 4. Then I've got the kind of emerging where I'm like, oh, this could be something. But it didn't fit that criteria of like the 2 randomized controlled trials, or there's no clinical guideline or systematic review. And within that, and then I've got levels where actually there's no evidence at all, which I think is important, like general gut health. And like things like dementia, again, that's kind of in that level. There's nothing convincing at the moment. And maybe it's because we haven't got the right strain. Or maybe there just will never be a benefit probiotics. But in that space, there's things like psoriasis.
In the emerging,
psoriasis, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
Oh, interesting.
Osteoarthritis, mental health, where there's a bit of a murmur that there could be something coming. But it's at a case where, again, it's more of a one-on-one in clinic. Would I consider that versus publicly being like, worth taking a probiotic here? Because I just think these are live microbes. They could be doing things that you don't want them to. So I want to make sure I feel quite confident before I start being like, oh, just take it. That whole kind of concept of insurance policy, I think can be dangerous here.
Yeah, it can be. Absolutely. Yeah. And in terms of the probiotics that are currently available today, it seems that they are commonly Lactobacilli in terms of the genus, Lactobacilli, Bifidobacteria, and Saccharomyces. Are we missing a trick by not looking at others, or is it because it's quite hard to manufacture those and culture those?
Yeah, look, I think it's just such a new science, right? And like, it takes so long to like scope out the genome of the microbe and like know its safety profile. But I absolutely think there will be future, like Akkermansiae, certain types of strains within that category, I think will come out as probiotics. But, these studies that I'm referring to, like, it's like 30 years of science, right? So the gut microbiome is still relatively new in terms of our appreciation of it. So actually, I guess the concept of any geeks out there like myself, the concept of probiotics was first kind of coined by a professor called Ali Metchnikoff in, I think, like 1907. So about over a century ago. And then you think the microbiome research, I think only in the last 5 years is really started to like develop, and still we don't know thousands of the bacteria living in our gut, right? So there's still so much we don't know.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's a really exciting space. More research is needed, and I think we'll get there. But it's just kind of tempering the excitement.
Yeah. I did a little bit of searching around on PubMed, and I just looked at the number of times probiotics in the title were looked at in papers between 95 and 2010. It was about 7,000, and between 2011 and 2025 it's like 50,000. So like it's really exploded. And prior to that there was like no mention of it pretty much. So it's really exploded recently, and I think the sort of frustration of the general public is it seems like probiotics are already here and people are taking them and they're having these like wonderful stories online, etc. But when you speak to professionals, we're very cautious about it. And so there's this disconnect between marketing hype and evidence base. And this is where I think it's really important to have these discussions about specific areas that we know we can hang our hat on with some degree of confidence that probiotics may have an impact. And others like weight loss and dementia and mental health, where there's promise, but you know what, probably would save you money for now.
Oh, I would say, just to clarify that, weight loss and dementia, I would say currently not convincing evidence.
Not convincing. Okay,
yeah, mental health
fine.
isn't that much. Just to fact check you, because I don't want anyone to say, oh, great, exciting.
I know when you said weight loss, my ears picked up. I'm like, okay, yeah, weight loss is probably going to be something
that's going to be huge.
Is that being marketed at the moment? Have you
so,
seen that,
I mean... You know, it has been, right? The systematic reviews are currently saying, don't waste your money in that space. There's been a couple of little ones showing like small weight loss. But again, I think they're quite biased. And if you want to lose weight, you know, losing half a kilo after 3 months, it's pretty clinically non-significant.
Right,
I think for now, unless there's some amazing strain, I mean, maybe it'll be fecal transplants where it's actually the whole microbiome seeding versus specific strain. I think there's a lot more going on mechanistically with weight management, with appetite regulation and all the different appetite hormones and stuff like that, you know, many of which are activated in the gut. So I think there's going to be a lot more that probably a probiotic wouldn't be able to help with weight management.
Yeah, there's a lot of people doing fecal microbiome transplants themselves. We won't go into that. Yeah, there's like, you know, YouTube videos and stuff of stool banking. All that
you know what? There was a really cool, just while we're talking about poo, because, you know, I spent my early 20s, you know, doing it in the lab, and it was just great times. Actually, so obviously C. difficile, really serious gut infection. We know that, you know, it's been approved and it's life-saving in those groups who don't respond to antibiotics. But actually more recently, there was a really convincing systematic review that came out for ulcerative colitis. And actually now, it's still obviously not mainstream in medical therapy, but I think St. Thomas's in London are now starting to consider it, the gastros, for certain types of UC. So anyone who's listening to this, you know, that might be something worth chatting to your gastro about.
That's super interesting.
Yeah.
As we're talking about mechanism, let's talk a little bit about the journey of a probiotic that you've chosen specifically for one of those 4 areas of complaint. What is actually going on? So I'm taking this probiotic, whether it's a liquid or a capsule, whatever it might be, and it's going into my body and it's hopefully getting to the area where it needs to be in my digestive tract. Then what happens? Like, what's it doing?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, it will depend on the strain and how it acts. Like if you think of the vaginal evidence, right? So those that formulation is taken orally, but it's been shown to arrive and survive in the vagina. And women are like, how is that happening? Through the blood. And it's obviously not through the blood for anyone, you know, not medical. That would just cause inflammation. That can't happen. But it's through the wiping mechanism we think is the key element. And that's why I think the lactoferrin helps with that kind of survival. So what happens is those microbes are thought to change the pH of the vagina and then prevent those things like candida overgrowing, because they only like to grow in certain types of environments, and also they eat all the food and prevent the other microbes from overgrowing. So that's a mechanism kind of in the vagina. Then when it's things like antibiotic associated diarrhea, so during antibiotics, the LGG, like it is the most kind of characterized. I think there's many different mechanisms. I think it activates the immune system. Obviously, 70% of the immune system lives in the gut. So I think it kind of, protects it a bit more or something like that. I think it also binds to sites that the bad microbes would have bound to, and therefore kind of prevents it from doing that.
Okay, so it's crowding them out or something?
Yeah, kind of crowd them out. And then also certain types of microbes can produce certain types of kind of toxins that will kill other microbes.
Okay.
So there's, a whole lot of different mechanisms that we think is going on to explain the clinical results that we see.
Gotcha. And a lot of people hear about these short-chain fatty acids that are being produced as byproducts of microbes in general, like not just the probiotic strains that you'll be consuming, but also your natural ones. Is that something that is heightened by certain strains, or is this...
I mean, it is a good question, I guess, because you need obviously the fiber. That's where the short chain fatty acids are produced from that ferment. And I think most people probably have, if you're having a decently high fiber diet, you've probably got a decent amount of the short chain fatty acid producing microbes in your gut. So I don't think the mechanism will really be around enhanced short chain fatty acid production. In fact, I'm not aware of any of the probiotic studies where they've showed increased levels of short chain fatty acids.
Okay.
Whereas obviously like fiber studies and prebiotic studies, you do see an increase in short chain fatty acid production. So I think probably obviously, again, there's some mechanistic studies that some people might not produce all the short chain fatty acids in the right amount.
Yeah.
But again, I'm not aware of any. But again, all the technicals, it's quite difficult with short chain fatty acids. We at King's College London, we measure short chain fatty acids for a number of our clinical trials. And actually a lot of the short chain fatty acids get absorbed through the gut lining, and therefore the amount that comes out in the store, if you measure it in the store, it's not always a good indicator of how much is actually being produced.
Okay.
So some of our studies, actually, we haven't really seen a difference, even though like for a low FODMAP diet where you would expect short chain fatty acids to reduce because you're cutting out some of the fiber, we don't see a huge difference. So it's kind of, it's a hard one to measure because of the absorption. And I guess that's this 9-meter digestive tract, right? It's long and it's all different parts are doing different things, and it's hard to, obviously they're now looking at, pills which can measure the pH at certain parts of the gut and get more insight mechanistically to what's happening.
Is that like an encapsulated endoscopy where you literally swallow it and it sends messages via Bluetooth or something? Yeah,
they call it a smart pill. We've used it in some of our clinical trials. And exactly that. You have to wear this monitor and it senses it and it kind of gives a reporting of the motility. You can see how it's moving and also the pH and stuff like that.
That's super cool.
Yeah,
that's definitely going to be turned into a wearable one day.
100%.
Sure. And in terms of objective measures, so when we're talking about the probiotics and these specific strains, it sounds like the studies were looking at symptoms like the likelihood of diarrhea in the case of antibiotic-associated diarrhea as an example. Are there any objective measures where we can actually measure the biome by a stool and actually show, okay, when you've taken this probiotic, it's either harmonized or crowded out some of those pathogenic bacteria that you find in your guts?
So there are studies that show that the bacteria survive and increase in number, but they've specifically, because they've been part of the probiotic study, shown that strain, so that was their focus. They didn't really measure other microbes that I'm aware of. And obviously there's, so many things we would love them to measure, but obviously it's an expensive thing, right? To be like, okay, has that changed diversity? And I guess, that's one of the things we don't typically see. A probiotic changes microbial diversity, which is why we don't recommend it for general gut health. But it does specifically, grow that. Most of the studies for most of the different types of strains, again, it will differ by strain, I suspect. By about 14 days, that strain usually dies off. So very few strains are thought to then get in there for life. And it depends on the individual as well. Like some individuals with really resistant microbiomes, unless you're dosing regularly, then the other ones will fight it and then it'll die off. Whereas other ones might have a little niche and then those get in there. So it's a really interesting space, and I think there's this whole level of personalization that will come, but we're just so far away from that. So it does frustrate me when I see companies being like, I'll test your microbiome and then give you the probiotics you need. I'm like, I wish. I would be signing up for that.
Do you think we'll ever get to that point?
Maybe in like 30 years.
30 years?
But
30 years?
I know, we'll be in the nursing home being like, God damn it, I wish I had that when I was younger.
Yeah.
Because it is just so complex. So just thinking about the microbiome, right?
Sure,
so we
yeah.
always focus on the bacterial component, right?
Yeah.
But there's also a virome, a virus component, and there's a microbiome, the fungal component. We've hardly touched the research. And there's also the parasites, some of which are thought to, synergistically work together. So there is so much we don't know. And then a lot of the bacteria we don't even know the name of, we haven't sequenced, that are living in us and doing stuff.
Yeah.
So if you kind of take that into picture, like, okay, yeah, it'll be probably 30 years. And also working in the research space, I see that like our food emulsifier study, ADAPT, I think we got the grant 7 years ago and we've only just published. And it was at a conference. We haven't even finished publishing like the peer-reviewed final paper.
Wow.
7 years. So it's like things take time because you got to recruit, you've got to do everything, get ethical approval.
Sure,
So yeah, good research annoyingly is challenging.
Slow moving, hey?
Yeah.
And silly question for me. So some of these gut tests, do we actually have, maybe not commercially available gut tests, but any gut tests in the research testing where we can map the virome and the microbiome and the parasite? Do you call it the parasitome?
Yeah. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, but I'll call it that, parasitome. So different research groups, I think, will look at the different types.
Okay.
Like our research group that we work with in Paris, who's doing the ADAPT analysis, they don't look at the virome or the microbiome. I think there's just a few research who've got the technology to kind of look at that. And also, I think, when we think about the microbiome test, it's also important to think about actually a lot of it will come down to not who's there, but what they're doing.
Yeah.
So like you and I could have the same microbes in our gut. But if you eat a certain way or do certain things, your microbes could act different, produce different metabolites than mine. And we did a study at King's where we looked at trying to predict response to a low FODMAP diet, and we looked at the microbiome. And the microbiome didn't necessarily give us the answers, but the volatile organic compounds, so the things the bacteria were doing, the chemicals they were producing, gave us a better predictor of who would respond and who didn't.
Gotcha. Okay.
So again, it just kind of highlights how complex this whole world is. And I think we will get there.
Yeah.
But there's a lot to do and a lot we don't know yet.
So if we're using like an analogy, like a football team, like you can have one team that's got like a Portuguese striker that's incredible and like a goalie from Brazil, and that might look like a completely different team to another one, or maybe they look the same. Maybe you got the same Portuguese striker but from a different area of Portugal, and then the same, but then the results of those two teams when they play can be completely different. So you might be looking at a snapshot of a team that looks the same, but the outcome is completely different.
Yeah.
And that's a bit of a weird analogy
there.
No.
I love the football. I mean, I'm sure everyone listening will love it if they're a male and into it. Sexist, I know. A lot of females do like it, but I am not one of them, and my husband loves it. So he'll enjoy that. So yeah, I mean, that's the whole concept of this personalization thing, but I want people to not be overwhelmed by that. And at the moment, appreciate that we're still very much, we just want to know what's good for the general person. Generally speaking, we see through all the clinical data that the Mediterranean diet is the one that will help us live longer. All the different plants and, fermented dairy, all that sort of stuff. Versus I think, this whole space of quinoa is better for me than buckwheat. Like we just aren't there. I want us to be there, but like there's just so many nuances to that. So I think I don't want people to go, oh my God, this is all just too overwhelming. I don't even know what to eat. I'm like, actually all healthcare professionals agree, like Mediterranean diet, extra virgin olive oil, those sorts of things is what, will lead to longer life. And there might be small little nuances between the individuals. And we will know more in like a decade, but like, let's just temper that until we kind of have that convincing science.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, just from what you're talking about, and we're in the sort of hypothesis territory here, I admit, but I'm less interested in who's there, and I'm more interested in what the outcome is. So this idea of metabolomics, so these compounds that they're producing, the metabolites, like, is that, do you think, where the money's going to be, where the puck's going in the future, where we should be more focused on?
100%. Because I think a lot of the bacteria probably can act very similar. So it doesn't necessarily matter if you've, got too much of this one or too much of that one. If they're doing the same functionality for your body, happy days.
And you can, I assume, achieve very similar outcomes in terms of those metabolites with different diets. So like, a Mediterranean flavored diet versus an Indian diet that's like more heavy on the lentils and whole wheats and stuff and breads, but you're still like producing very healthy outcomes.
100%. And I think that's why there's a lot of 100% coming from him because I'm completely aligned. But I think that, it definitely makes sense, and why all the scientists are saying there is no one healthy microbiome. Do you know what I mean? Like an individual have their healthy microbiome of the most diverse and stuff, but we could both have like amazing microbiomes that look quite different because of it's about functionality, I think.
Okay. And in terms of like how you might approach someone who has a low carb preference, let's say, like, would you be super worried that they're restricting certain elements of their diet, or do you think it is achievable to have the similar outcomes with a dietary preference that might be lowering in whole grains?
Look, I think absolutely it's all about the individual, right? I think it's so ridiculous to be like, everyone needs to have 3 serves of whole grains and stuff, like, because no, even if we've got data to suggest that might be healthy for the individual, if they don't enjoy the taste or they don't want to do it, they're not going to do it. And therefore, if we're giving them strict advice, they'll just rebel and go crazy and gung-ho and stuff. What I would say is that we do see that each different type of species, plant species, particularly different groups, I call them the super six, everyone's calls them different things, but you've got your whole grains, your nuts and seeds, your fruit, your veg, your legumes, so chickpeas, butter beans, and your herbs and your spices. And actually each different kind of category does contain slightly different polyphenols and foods like that. So there was a great study from, I think, Bergen University or University of Bergen. And what they looked at was those kind of different super six and how much extra years they would add to your life. And they showed that legumes had the greatest impact in terms of, I think it was like 2.5 years of additional healthy years to your life. And it had greater impact than like fruit, for example. And again, that's not to say that the legume fiber is more protective. It's probably just because it's an easier win and most people aren't having legumes. So I guess my take home from that is that each different category, and they looked at nuts and whole grains as well, provides different things, and therefore you don't need to go and have a whole load of whole grains or carbs if that's not what you want to do. But worth thinking about, okay, well, if I'm not having any grains, what nutrients am I missing? And a lot of people miss things like fructans, and there's all different chains of fructan, like they're prebiotics for those who are unaware of that. And there's all different chain lengths, so all different types of the fructans. So it's just thinking about what's the ramifications of that. And I guess it feeds into, the demon of gluten, where they've shown that if people exclude gluten when they don't need to, i.e. they don't have celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, then they seem to have a decrease in the microbial diversity. Not because gluten's some prebiotic an amazing thing. It's because they're cutting out barley, wheat, and rye, which contain those fructans and other things. There's always often consequences, I was going to say, of cutting things out.
Gotcha. We mentioned the World Gastro Organization. There is a probiotic guide.uk, which I would imagine would be similar to the recommendations from the WGO, but what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I know some of the clinicians, I've worked with them, like, Smart Strain stuff is on there. But what I would say, so firstly, kudos to them for trying to pull this together. I find myself not recommending that because I think it is not as accurate as I would want it to be. So for example, in there, they have level 1, they've given kind of higher level, I think it's 1, 2, 3, level 1 evidence for weight loss for that probiotic. And I'm like, not sure, like they don't look at necessarily the systematic reviews and what the body of evidence is saying. And then there's another one in there for managing.
So I was going to say there's one for cholesterol, but that's level 2.
Level 2. And
one for constipation, level 1.
So again, a lot of them don't take into account like the effect size. Like some of the effects, yes, it might be statistically significant, but actually, clinically we would be like, that's not worth taking.
Gotcha.
Do this instead. It's going to
yeah.
have oats, going to be much more effective and things like that. So I think we need to, that's what it doesn't necessarily do, the effect size.
Sure.
And there's another one in there because I was like, oh my God, amazing. I must be missing this study. Anyway. And it was, I think it's in like managing eczema in infants.
Okay.
And the study had, and they gave it level 1 evidence. The study had 8 patients in the probiotic group, and the study was actually in Japanese, so I couldn't access it. But the clinical outcomes, I was kind of like, anyway, when you look at the systematic reviews of managing eczema, for preventing eczema, I think there is some convincing evidence for Lactobacillus HNO1 if mum takes it during pregnancy. So if you've got a family risk of it, but managing it, the jury is still out. So it's kind of a bit of an unknown. And if you were really wanting to, like a 1-on-1 clinic, there's probably more convincing evidence for the L. fermentum species. So you look at the specific strain within that.
Okay.
So, and that probiotic they've recommended is a bifidobacterium one. And actually the product has got emulsifiers in it, and it's a baby product, which grinds my gears because you do not need like sometimes, yes, I get you sometimes need emulsifiers for certain things. Yeah. You do not need it in a liquid baby probiotic, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's those sorts of things that make me go, I love the concept and I hope this works, over time. And maybe it's more like kind of what I was saying, there needs to be approval via the clinical guideline or a systematic review. If it is, then they can kind of put them in there versus just putting all random ones that companies have submitted, right?
Yeah,
So it could be biased.
Because I was really excited when I saw this initially. I looked at the About page. There's clinicians on both sides from really reputable places, like, including King's and everything else. But then I started looking at some of the products, and whilst the products have got, specific strains that have been used in antibiotic-associated diarrhea studies, when you look at the products themselves, actually a lot of them did have emulsifiers, lots of sugars, lots of things that we know, holistically speaking, are not great to have in your diet every single day. And
are unnecessary in these products, which is what what grinds my gears, right? And the whole ultra-processed food movement, right? It's like a lot of them are unnecessary. Some, yes, you need to have preservatives if you want your bread to last more than 2 days, right? We get that. But like a lot of them aren't. And
Okay. So, I mean, like, people can go check it out themselves, probiotic.uk. I'm pretty sure it's like I don't know if it's funded, commercial or anything, but it seems like it's an academic.
And I know the researchers are super lovely. One of them is a lovely dietitian. And, I mean, so I don't think they're getting commercial funding necessarily from it. I think so. Anyway, people can look at the website. They can make up their own minds, I think, is the best thing to say about
definitely. On the subject of emulsifiers, additives, we mentioned at the top of this that we should be emulsifier aware or additive aware. Let's talk a bit about that, because you've done some work on these additives that are commonly found in ultra-processed foods. What actually goes on when we consume them, and why are they added in the first place?
Yeah, so if we think of the whole additive world, right, I think there's like over 400 that have got this approval called GRAS, generally regarded as safe.
Okay.
And that just means that they've gone through rigorous safety testing, right? People don't want to kill us, thankfully. But a lot of that testing was done before we appreciate our gut microbiome. So actually, I think even the health bodies are now going, okay, we need to reassess the safety profile of these different categories. Okay. And they've all got different roles. Like emulsifiers helps kind of bind the oil and the water components, so you don't get like peanut butter that splits and dressings that split. They've all got different roles. Some of them are needed, right? We live in a very fast-paced world. We don't all have time, unlike you, Rippy, to make bread every day.
I don't make it every day. I make it once a week and I freeze it, and then I use it during the week. It's brilliant.
I mean, that is super smart. I do respect that. And I think that is goals for me, but I'm not there yet.
I've only got one kid.
So they do have a role, and I don't want to demonize them all, right? Like ascorbic acid. Oh my God, super scary. Vitamin C, that sort of stuff. But our team at King's did just finish that world first clinical trial looking at Crohn's disease. So people with mildly to moderately active Crohn's disease. Okay. Because there was some animal studies that suggested those who were genetically susceptible to gut inflammation, high inflammatory bowel disease, would have a poor response to certain types of emulsifiers. So what we did is randomize 154 patients, and the amazing team, Dr. Mansell, I'm not going to go to everyone's names because I'm going to forget, Alicia, Amy, like that was part of their 3 PhDs, right? Okay. So really cool stuff. And some of it was done during COVID, which was a nightmare. Anyway, 154 patients, half of them were randomized to a low emulsifier diet.
Okay.
The other half had an emulsifier containing diet, but it was blinded. No, it was in line with what they would have eaten, right? Okay, so it's not like excessive to get that through ethics. Can you imagine? That was not possible. So it's what the general, person would have. And they were blinded, which I think is just, it was tricky, obviously, to have to relabel everything, but it was really important, right? Because the nocebo effect is huge, which is the opposite of the placebo effect. And then followed up over 8 weeks. And those in the low emulsifier group, we just published the results of the ECHO conference, had a significant improvement in their disease symptoms and severity compared to the emulsifier containing diet. Okay. And as you would know, Crohn's disease is very much, outside, I guess, enteral nutrition is very much being like just medically treated. Whereas a lot of patients are like, I think something's going with diet. So that's why I say emulsifier aware, because there's like 60 plus emulsifiers. We excluded them all because it was a mechanistic proof of principle study. Now we're starting to look at the different types of emulsifiers. And what I suspect is like, because we did dose back some of the emulsifiers like polysorbate 80 and carrageenan. And
those are
CMC,
commonly found, aren't they? Like in a lot of ultra.
Yeah, exactly.
So what was that? Polysorbate 80?
Polysorbate 80, carrageenan, and CMC, carbomethyl.
And carrageenan, does that come from seaweed? Right, yeah.
And in a lot of plant-based milks. So interesting. But anyway, that's kind of where we are. Like I said, we are now submitting it for peer review in a journal. So when the study's released, we can share the full study. But yeah, that's why I'm like, particularly if you've got genetic susceptibility, obviously, to Crohn's disease or gut inflammation, you need to be aware. But I think everyone, and that's why I think like the baby's guts with probiotics, I'm like, here parents are trying to do good and they're giving, it's only got 3 ingredients in it. It's like oil, probiotic, and emulsifier. And it's unnecessary. So that's why I'm just a bit like, Do
you think that outside of people who are genetically susceptible to things like Crohn's, there may be a benefit as well of being emulsifier aware generally?
So I guess when I think of my own family, because I think it's the best way to like what you actually really believe, I am emulsifier aware. So I'm not like, you can't eat anything with emulsifiers in it, because like soy lecithin, my gut feeling is that's probably not going to have the same effect as something like CMC or carrageenan or polysorbate 80. But again, we don't know the data at the moment, so I'm not like super strict, but it's just a case of and then also knowing that obviously these are a lot of ultra processed foods, and we know generally the whole food alternative is going to be much better for you. So wraps is one that I'm now like.
Wraps, honestly, we were literally talking about how we need to do a whole video series on wraps and how to create swaps for wraps, because they're super convenient. I used to love wraps, but when you read the packet, it's like, there's just everything in it.
People legitimately think they're a much healthier option to bread.
Yeah, they look healthy. They're brown, and
there is one brand, and I'll put it. I'll let you know. I can't. M or C, and actually, that's the one my family has now. So it's the wheat and extra virgin olive oil. I don't think they put salt in it. And so that's the one.
I'm always trying to point people in the direction of like really
of
good.
Exactly.
And in terms of like, and we might be leaning a bit too much on the animal studies here, but in terms of the mechanism behind why these additives are detrimental to the gut, do we have an idea of like what's going on? Yeah,
we think like because they have that emulsification effect, right? In food, because we've obviously got the mucus lining in our gut, right? So we've got a gut and they've got all that thick mucus. So the animal studies have shown that those
just explain that mucus layer actually for folks, because I don't think, because I can appreciate the cross section of the gut and you've got this mucin layer and all the rest of it, but maybe
so if you think of your gut like this hollow tube, right? And that inside the gut is kind of like this thick, nice mucousy layer, kind of to protect it, and microbes live in that mucousy level. as well. And what the animal studies, which kind of led us on to doing that first clinical trial, showed is that the certain emulsifiers seem to thin down that mucus layer, which essentially means that bacteria can encroach and get onto the actual lining of the gut and activate the immune system and trigger inflammation. So that was one of the main mechanisms. And then perhaps it is changing the profile of the microbes.
Gotcha.
So we're now doing, I'm saying we, the Paris team, and actually no, some of our King's team are now doing like the metabolomic stuff for the study and also the transcriptomics to look at not just what the bacteria have done or how they've changed, but also the proteins and the things that they're doing, and whether that changed between the high emulsifier and low emulsifier group.
Okay.
So loads more research come out of that. But
that sounds like a lot. I mean, like just even that mucus layer, if we're reducing that or like thinning it, then that's having a detrimental effect on the gut barrier and how robust that is. And this term leaky gut gets banded around quite a bit. What do you say when people say leaky gut? How do you explain what leaky gut is?
Yeah, so I guess my take on the science is very much it's not a black and white diagnosis. Like we all get a leaky gut. They've got studies that if we are super stressed, our gut lining and leakiness, I guess the scientific name for that is permeable, which means essentially things that wouldn't be allowed to get into our bloodstream from our gut are able to. So it's like these little holes, it's a bit loose. But then take the stress away, that goes away. Same with alcohol. We have too much alcohol.
Yeah.
Celiac disease is probably the best one chronically,
yeah.
where if you're having even little amounts of gluten, when you have celiac disease, you will chronically have that kind of leaky, permeable gut.
Mm-hmm.
And that just, like I said, means that things like even good bacteria, if they get into your blood system, as we alluded to, that can create inflammation because it's like, you should not be here. So that's kind of the way that I describe it. And I don't think it's, some people have said it's the root cause of everything. And I'm like, no, it's more of a symptom of something else.
Sure.
Or a sign of something else. So in our emulsifier study, we're looking at gut leakiness. So through sugar tests to have a look at whether that is a mechanism that's changed or not.
Gotcha.
Really hard to measure, but we'll see.
It's really hard, even with the sugar test, right? Because that is quite hard to
collect urine for
interpret.
24 hours. And then, I think where the sugar is absorbed can be slightly different from people. And
Gotcha.
there's a lot of urine
Yeah.
being sent into Kings along with poo. So it's fun times over in the lab.
I love that.
You should come join us sometime.
I will
for
come and
analysis.
join you. We and Poo Party. This has been great. Thank you so much. I think we've covered a lot on probiotics, how to determine whether you need them, what to look for, looking up those strains. It does feel, I think, even for me, like I need to have a PhD in probiotics to actually decipher which one might be appropriate. And I guess for folks at home, some of these websites that we've alluded to and some of those areas from the World Gastro Organization would be useful. Are there any specific people who really should steer clear of probiotics? So is there any evidence to suggest that they could be doing untold harm?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. So I think anyone with a suppressed immune system needs to be cautious, but actually, again, it will come back to the strain. So there is some clinical trials showing that the LGG strain of bacteria can help prevent specific types of chemotherapy-induced diarrhea. Mm-hmm. So safety profile has been, shown in that scenario. Again, I would, as a healthcare professional, I put that forward to the team and be like, okay, well, what chemotherapy they're on, all of that sort of stuff. Yeah. But I would be always careful if your immune system's suppressed in any sort of way. Yeah. I think if you've recently had a gut surgery, bariatric surgery, something like that, I would just be, again, just mechanistically, if the gut's like super permeable and healing, probably would want to wait 3 months. And again, then be very specific about the strain and make sure it kind of aligned. So for me, and then obviously the preterm infants, like I said, but again, using where there is evidence. I would always want to make sure, like if you are pregnant, then again, the strains have been approved, are safe during pregnancy. So for example, the lactobacillus LGG and BB12 both being approved as safe in pregnancy. That vaginal formulation safe in pregnancy, which is good, obviously, because things like thrush and BB are heightened during those periods. So, you just need to check, essentially.
That's brilliant. quick hot take on GLP-1s. That's coming up from proper left field there. What's going on with the gut?
Well, I mean, we know that the microbes help stimulate the gut to produce GLP-1s and the short-chain fatty acids when we eat the fiber. That's one of the mechanisms of how fiber gives that satiety effect, right? I mean, I think in terms of the drugs out there, one of the dangers, like every individual can do what they want, right? I would say one of the dangers that we need to be careful of is people go on them and, you know, it works obviously by just reducing down the appetite. So they're just having half a croissant, half a Mars bar, that sort of stuff. So actually they become really malnourished. So they can still be bigger in a size, but not getting any of the fiber because they're like, my tummy won't fit that in anyway, and I don't want to be more full. They're not getting any of the micronutrients, polyphenols, all that sort of stuff. So it can be done very dangerously, but it can be done really beneficial. I'm sure you've seen in clinic, you know, if you have someone who's really struggling, who's got, you know, really high BMI, and they just need that little helping hand to be like, you know what, I can do this, and then get that motivation to see some of the weight coming off. They're more likely to feel comfortable in the gym, you know, eating healthier food because they're motivated, but they need to be counseled through that, right? So I don't know if that's something that align with you, but so I can see it as both sides.
Yeah, no, 100%. I definitely see that, look, they're here to stay and they're getting better and better, I think. And I think the results are phenomenal from a weight point of view, but I think what I worry about is the abuse and the cycling and the fact that all the studies are done with healthy lifestyle intervention as well. And I think a lot of people forget that. And it's sort of been touted as a magic pill. In fact, Johan Hari was on the podcast last year, who's been on Ozempic for a year, wrote his book, The Magic Pill. And this is literally how people see it. And I think it really needs a reframing. So if you are going to take it, I would highly recommend getting lifestyle interventions, exercise, protecting your muscles, protecting your fiber and protein intake. These are all things that should be sort of caveats and sort of sold with the product as well. It should be an adjunct. So
and I think a lot of reputable practices now are making that as part of it. So the medics and dietitians are working together. So I know the Gut Health Clinic girls are now part of a medical pathway where if someone is going to go on it, they have to see the dietitian, which is not always easy because like, I'm being forced to see you, I don't want to see you, but at least, you know, the pathway's there to be, you know, protected. But obviously there's so much being sold online and stuff.
Totally. Thank you so much. This is great. I feel a lot more educated on probiotics, and I really hope our listeners are a lot clearer about what is a really complicated area. So really appreciate your time.
I've had a ball. Thanks for having me.
If you loved that episode, you will love the full library of podcasts from the Doctor's Kitchen Library. We talk about everything from inflammation, supplements, and food as medicine. Just like this episode right here. You can click it right now and check it out.